Welcome to this lecture. Nice to see that you are so many. As you perhaps know, I work in the house with what I call the phytobenthic communities. That is the part of the ocean that is covered with vegetation. So it's, you can say in principle, it's a defaultic zone. So today I will have a main emphasis will be to talk about which species you might find. I show pictures and I also discuss why they are there. And I will show some of the results from my long-term ecological research in the Baltic Sea. Some of you have already seen it. You can sleep then. Others, perhaps something is new for you. There are some pictures you haven't seen, I hope. So, and anytime you can interrupt me and ask a question, and whenever I talk some Swinglish you don't understand. So, probably you heard about the Baltic Sea, how it looks like. It's crucial for the phytobenthic communities. The crucial area here is this very shallow sill area between Sweden and Denmark, Öresund and the belt areas, where it's a maximum of 17 meters, which it hinders the more marine salt water to come into the basin. But if you look at this map, there's another two features that I want that you see. It is that there is a deep basin here, what we call the Baltic proper. Then we have the Baltic Sea, a new next deep area, and then we have a sill again, and we have the Botnian Bay. So there are three different oceans in the Baltic Sea, except of these small fringing areas here. So there are three basins, and they all have about some different features from a oceanographic point of view, which are more or less important for the species. The most dramatic thing is happening up here in the northern Quark, where salinity drops from about 5 to 2, and we get almost fresh water. I will just briefly take through the evolution. I think Lena will give a very nice talk tomorrow about speciation and so on in salinity gradient. But the Baltic Sea is quite a young ecosystem, as you know. Only the last 3,000 years about it has had this salinity as it has today. Before it was higher and even lower. It was fresh water for a period. So there are very few species that have managed to come into the Baltic Sea. There are of two categories, I could say. That's the marine species, which have then adapted to the marine system. When they come into the Baltic Sea, they come in an area where the salinity is less along them, and then by the process of osmosis, water will penetrate into their bodies and they will explode eventually, if they don't have a mechanism for pumping out the water. And this is an important factor. The same is for the freshwater species, but on the other direction. So what that means, that they have to have something to keep out the water or keep the water in the body. That means they need a lot of energy to have this process going on. So the species you see in the Baltic Sea, the marine species, they usually are much smaller in the Baltic Sea than they are in their natural environment, in the marine environment. So this is an example of how the salinity increases, how the blue mussel, the size of the blue mussel, which is a marine species, decreases with the decrease in salinity. So you will never find these large 10 centimeters mussels in the Botnian Sea. It's impossible for them. from the physiological point of view. And also, it's the same for the freshwater species. In this case, I try to draw a Theodoxus fluviatilis, which is a common freshwater snail, also common in the Baltic Sea. It decreases its shell size or shell strength and gets smaller in the brackish water environment. But then, of course, there are some species that can survive with no effect at all. And those are those that are adapted to these changing environments. For instance, this is a gamma reed that usually lives in tide pools. So they encounter a salinity from 0 to perhaps 40 or 50. So this is example from the animal side, but it's exactly the same process among the plants. So this is a problem when you make examinations in the Baltic Sea. And you use one of these classical books. Nothing is directly the same as said in the book because everything is much smaller. I think Nisse showed this picture. The interesting thing is that in the area where we have the salinity of the Baltic Sea, we have a natural minimum of species. So the Baltic Sea as such is species poor. And this has nothing to do with any pollution or some eutrophication or whatever. It is only that this area is species poor. And that's good for us who work with the determination. I know that Nisse showed this picture. This only shows how the salinity influences the number of marine species in the Baltic Sea. So we have very high numbers, or over 1,500 on the Swedish west coast. The major drop is then when we come into the Baltic Sea, it goes down to about 1/10 of the species we find on the true marine areas. And then it decreases the further north we go into the Baltic Sea. And this is, I know, this is a very nice picture, and most people have this one in their mind, and they think, oh, the Baltic Sea is species poor. We made quite a lot of investigations along the coast, not only me, several people, many people. And this is Sweden tilted. You see the different landscapes here. They have different names or abbreviation. Vad heter det? Förkortningar. If you look to the number of plants we find along the Swedish coast, from the Swedish west coast up to the northern Botnian Bay, we see that most species we find on the Swedish west coast, on the two landscapes on the Swedish west coast. But when we come into the Baltic Sea, the number of species decreases. This is a species found by divers and investigations along the coast, observing. But the interesting thing with this graph, I would say that once we are in the Baltic Sea, the number of species are about the same all over the area. So we have about as much species in the northernmost parts of the Botnian Sea as we have in the southern part of the Botnian Sea. This is very important to remember. However, the composition changes dramatically. So on the Swedish west coast and the south coast here, we mainly have algae. We have the red algae, we have the green algae, and we have these are the brown algae. Green, brown, no, red and brown. And what happens when we go further into the Baltic Sea, the proportion of higher plants increases. So when we finally come to the northernmost part of the Botnian Sea, there are almost no brown and red algae left. We have one red algae, as I know, from marine environment that still lives here up in the northern part, the Ceramion tiniquerne. But mainly we find a lot of nice, interesting phanerogams or higher plants. It's always a problem when we talk about biodiversity. So the former picture showed us that we would expect to find almost the same amount of species all over the Baltic Sea, but the composition is different. And we know that from experience that there are some hotspots in the Baltic Sea where we have quite a lot of species. This is around the field station of Tvärminne, it's around the field station of Askö, it's around the field station of Norrbyn, and it's around the field station of Kalmar, and also in the Sound area. And this is very peculiar if you look to the distribution of biodiversity. You know, there are so hotspots that you can't explain it except for effort. Of course, there the science sit and watch. In all other areas, people don't sit and watch. So when you want to compare biodiversity, it's extremely important that you use the same technique, use the same amount of effort to see how many species there are. You will never find all the species that are in one area, but you will find a certain amount which can be comparable. The interesting thing is when we look to the species distribution, how frequent they are, and this is good if we do some research and we just want to have an overview of species, and we can also have an idea of which species we should look after, is to look how often they occur and in our samples or observations, and perhaps also how much they contribute to the biomass, total biomass that we look, if you look in 1 square meter of a sample, for instance. And then we see that there are only but a few species, about 10, 15 species, which you all should learn, those are the ones that you will perhaps encounter when you go out in the field. The rest, they just occur occasionally or in special areas. So if you want to be lazy on Tuesday, so just try to learn these 15 species which are common in the Ask area. They are also common in the most part of the Baltic Sea. This is just showing the same graph for the west coast. It's again about 15, 16 species that are the common ones. The rest are extremely rare, but this list is of course much longer if you go to the Swedish west coast due to the more marine species. So, typical view, I think we can we skip the top? Yes, I think take it off. Just, yeah, så tack så mycket. This is a typical picture from the Swedish west coast. We have close to the surface, we have an abundance of kelp species, brown algae. We have some filamentous algae. This is the Ascophyllum, Fucus serratus. Further up we have perhaps Fucus vesiculosus. If we go deeper down, we find a bulk. The typical thing that you see on the Swedish west coast is this immense amount of different algal species and also a lot of different plant species. We have the hydrozoans, we have the bryozoans, we have green algae, red algae, brown algae, different species, fish. It's quite diverse. Even deeper down it's quite diverse with some coralline species coming in, so that's quite interesting. If we stand on the seashore and look into the water on the Swedish west coast and compare it with how it looks on the Baltic Sea coast, On the Swedish west coast, we see some interesting features. The species usually grow very close to the surface, even above the surface. Some species grow. For instance, Fucus vesiculosus is typical for growing above the surface. Below Fucus, there is a belt of Fucus serratus, usually. Also a Fucus, a kelp type of plant, brown algae. And below that, we see the occurrence of red algae, the laminarian, the large laminarians. When you go to the Swedish east coast, to the Askö area, you will see that on Tuesday, there is nothing at the surface except for filamentous algae. And those filamentous algae, they are down to about 1/2 meter depth. And below 1/2 meter, we start with Fucus vesiculosus. And this is quite interesting. Fucus vesiculosus growing at the surface or above the surface on the Swedish west coast grows below the surface, always 1/2 meter and deeper. Why does it always start at 1/2 meter? You can ask yourselves. What is setting the limit there? Do you have an idea? Those who have heard me before know. What can be the set that is, it's 1/2 meter all over the area? What can do that?
The tides?
Yeah, the tides should be one of the explanations. But in the Baltic Sea, we have a tide about 5 centimeters, so it doesn't have such an influence on the system. On the Swedish west coast, we have a tide about 10, 15 centimeters perhaps, so, and you actually can see it. But in the Baltic Sea, you never see tides.
That's why we have a Kattegat above the surface, because there the tide range is high.
Yeah.
Ice.
Ice is a good explanation, but then there should be areas where ice doesn't occur, and there's still 1/2 meter it starts. Horrible. It can't be ice. The simple answer is it's air pressure. Air pressure. The air pressure makes the water alternate. So we have low water and high water in the Baltic Sea. Depending, if we have a high pressure, we have low water. And there are periods of low water that can, of high pressure for weeks, for instance. So the upper 1/2 meter can be dried out. So no perennial species that live more than 1 year, can survive or will survive in that area. Therefore, and Fucus being a perennial, it occurs closer, but only perhaps for a season, then it's dried out and disappears. So this extremely hard, this sharp line is set by the water level fluctuations. I will later show you where ice also plays a very important role for decreasing the occurrence of the upper part of the phytobenthic communities, the species distribution. This is again a typical picture, I would say, from late autumn, because I see there are red algae here sitting at the surface. Here even we have a high water level because here is an area of no algae growth. Then there comes the algae, and then we have the perennials. Also a nice picture showing of how the Fucus starts at low water level. Yeah, it's low water level because I see that these algae, they can only grow in water. And the other thing is they are green. So the interesting thing is about this upper 1/2 meter, it has a explicit seasonality. So what you expect in spring is a number of green and brown algae, which then are replaced by these green algae, the Cladophora, and then they are replaced by Ceramium tenicorne in late autumn that you saw in the previous slide. So there is not, if you look at the whole phytobenthic community, it's not static. It's quite seasonal. So that the number of epiphytes, the number of species you find will change during the season. The only thing that is more or less dynamic are the perennial attached species. They will sit there probably also the next year. You can't be sure, but the probability is quite high. If you go down to dive in this water, you will find, say, the one of the more shall I call it key species, indicating species, is Fucus vesiculosus. The species, the marine species that on the Swedish west coast only grows at the sea surface and perhaps higher up. In the Baltic Sea, most of the species that grow below the Fucus vesiculosus on the west coast are gone, and there is no competition anymore for space deeper down. So Fucus there is very few species that compete for space with Fucus, so it can just grow as steep as it wants or as steep as it can. The limiting factors for Fucus distribution usually is salinity. They grow only up to or down to about 4 per mil. It is the substrate. They need hard substrates and light. So when light disappears or gets too low, they can grow. So usually in the Baltic Sea, the lower limit is set by light, if there is enough with hard substrates in the area. Below the Fucus communities we find, and also growing under Fucus, we find red algae. In this case, it's Fucellaria lumbricalis. You will see it. It's gaffeltång in Swedish. I think it's what's the English name? They use it for agar production. We have these fine bodied Ceramium tenuicorni, and all these white spots here are hydrobia snails. Tusensnäckor in Swedish. They occur always in masses, so therefore they are called thousand snails in Sweden. This Fucus communities still occurs in the Bothnian Sea all over. Here is a typical Fucus with these reproduction glands and also epiphytes of Ceramium tenuicorni sitting here. And this is a brown algae you will also see on Tuesday, Dictyosiphon funiculaceus, which are quite normal, common in the area during late summer. If we go further north, and also when the substrate changes, we get quite a lot of phanerogams, as I showed in the graph, and most of those have freshwater origin. There are only but a few phanerogams that actually can live in marine environments. I think it's about 20 or so in the entire world. And among those are Zostera marina, which occurs in the Baltic Sea, and Rupia, 2 Rupia species, which also occur in the Baltic Sea. If we come to the northernmost bay of the Baltic Sea, that means just up in the north where the Santa Claus is living, it looks like this. It's almost depleted. The areas on hard substrates, we usually see about nothing. There are small filamentous algae growing here There are snails creeping around, but it's functioning ecosystem. Why is it like this? Yeah, there again, then we are on the, I think, the 64th latitude, so it's quite high up. And at that latitude, although they have midnight sun, the sun rays come quite, on an angle to the water, and much is reflected, so there is very little energy going to the water. And during winter, ice covers the area for about 150 days. That is almost half a year. Also taking away the light. And therefore, in the Botnian Bay, we almost only find annual species. Those that cope, they come up every year when the light conditions are good, then they grow. And there are but very few perennial species. This is again up there. It's very beautiful, extremely beautiful. It's like swimming over a desert. I like that. Who doesn't want to go to Namibia? But it could look like a desert also when you come back to the Baltic Sea. This is a typical extremely wave-exposed cliff area in the outer parts of the Asker area. Here, again, the wave motions are so extreme that anything that grows higher will be torn away. So here again, we don't find, for instance, fucus, which is a species people think of. Well, as long as we see fucus, everything is good. But here you never will find fucus because the wave action is too high. This is again, you have to know, if you don't find a species, it might be a bad indication, but it also might be just natural. The other extreme, if you go to the ultra sheltered base of in the Asker area, you have this abundance of different phanerogams. Almost all of them of freshwater origin, and in this case they're also covered by filamentous algae, so you can hardly see them, but we will collect, and you yourself will collect them on Tuesday. This is a graph just showing how the species are dependent on the wave movement for their depth distribution. The general rule is the deeper you go, the more soft the substrate gets. This is always the case. You always end up in a soft substrate eventually. If you're in a sheltered bay, it comes from 1 decimeter. If you're on the most exposed sites, it perhaps comes at 25, 30, 40 meters. But the substrate will always turn into soft substrate eventually. This has a major influence, of course, on the species. All species that need hard substrates, they are limited to very shallow areas in sheltered areas. Whereas when the exposure increases, they can also increase the depth distribution. And at the same thing applies to the phanerogams, which all are rooted, or almost all are rooted. One exception, Ceratophyllum. They need any kind of soft substrate. And the soft substrate gets more and more rare the more exposed the site is. And therefore we don't find them in the most exposed sites because it's a lack of substrate. And the soft substrate goes too deep, starts too deep down for them to actually survive with that low light conditions. This thing about the substrate is quite important if you want to apply your knowledge of plants distribution and try to apply it on monitoring, for instance. One of the features that things we do in the Baltic Sea is to look at the depth distribution of different species. And this is a measure for the condition in the water. But because the depth distribution is then from the theory dependent on the light conditioning. And light condition is dependent on the quality of the water, if where it's murky or the lot of plankton production and so. The more eutrophicated an area is, the less light goes down, deeper down. And therefore, this maximum depth distribution is quite a good, rough estimate of how good the water quality is. But then you must be aware of that sometimes the substrate is setting the limit, not the depth. And therefore you always, when you do your observations, you always have to write down what kind of substrate you look at. So this is a standard if you go doing monitoring or whatever observation in the phytobenthic communities. Always state the type of substrate. Whether it is a hard substrate that is rock, boulders, large stones, or is it a mixed substrate with gravel and sand, pure sand or soft substrate, because you will find different species depending on the type of substrate. Shall I speak 1.5 hours just like this and you're dead, or shall you want a break? I can speak all afternoon if you want. It's no problem. This graph shows, it's an area, Asker laboratory is up here somewhere. I can't show it where it is because the wall is here. This is on the western part of the Asker area where I have several stations, or I visited several stations a while ago. And I looked to the composition of the species, and this is quite interesting. All these species, it encounters a lot of stations, in all 10, I think, 11, 10, where a few are from sheltered areas, and then some from more exposed areas, and some are extremely exposed. And if you do a multivariate analysis of these on the data of the species composition, you get these features. You know, you can all read dendrograms. You know how they work? No one says anything. Everyone knows everything. It's like a family tree, I can say. Those that are close to each other here, those are very similar to each other, and those that are very far from each other, like up here, this one is quite different from all the others. And these three are different from all the others. You understand what I'm talking about? What are you talking about?
Similar in what aspects?
Similar in species composition and biomass, for instance. So they have the same number of species or same amount of species, and also the proportion between species is the same. So you can put in abundance, or you can put in a biomass or whatever in these graphs. And you can also just look at the occurrence of species in the simplest form. This one is, I think, based on biomass. But what we see here is, and this graph shows similarity. 100% means that the two stations are exactly the same. And then the difference here, it's a 50% difference between this one and the rest. But what we quite soon learn here, if this is where we analyze with plants and animals together, and this with plants and animals separately. And what we see here, what we learn from this is that the number of plants we will find, those will vary quite a lot from station to station because they're quite dependent on what kind of wave exposure it is. Whereas the animal species, they are more similar all over the area. They have a similarity of 70% or higher. The plants have about sometimes only 30% or higher. You haven't worked with dendrograms. No one says anything. How many have worked with dendrograms? 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Not so many. Okay. Did you understand what I said? Good. This means that if you want to separate stations, or if you want to compare stations, be aware where you are, because from natural point of view, the stations will always be different in the species composition when looking at plants. Yes?
So the animals are then not sensitive to the plant composition as much. So even if they're not sensitive to wave action, it's also not transmitted through.
Yeah. Less sensitive to, and there is as you say, a less coupling to the plants. Perhaps it also reflects that there are few plants that are dominating, which are plant independent. For instance, Mytilus. Yes.
But could it be also, plants, maybe the diversity of plants and the species richness is much higher, so you have the likelihood of having different species of higher composition chain and differences in composition is higher if you have more species. The Baltic Sea has not many animal species, so then the differences are also not that strong. Is that also?
It could be, but I think we have in our samples we have about equal amounts of plants and animals. Okay. But they are. I think one of the major things that we get this is that there are a few dominating ones which are then plant independent, and therefore we get this picture. This again shows how you can distinguish how important the wave, the water movement is for the species. This is Mytilus, which only can grow in cracks here. Because if it would grow up here, in the Baltic Sea, Mytilus has to fight against the low salinity. So much of the energy goes to pumping out water, and therefore they can't allocate so much energy for shells and their byssus. These small threads they attach to the substrate, and therefore they only can foot, or whatever you say, in cracks. Otherwise they will be just torn away. This is not the phenomenon of grazing. It's just the phenomenon of wave action. Usually you see this explanation in the world literature that if species live in a crack, it's a typical sign of escape from predation. But I think it's in many cases, even in fully marine areas, it is due to the harsh physical environment that they actually seek out cracks, especially in the intertidal zone. Again, this is a picture showing how important the wave motion is in the Baltic Sea. Those are Pilaella sitting on 8-meter depth in the Salvorev area, whereas the Salvorev area, it's in between the island of Gotland and the Gotska Sandön. Those who are Swedish know perhaps a little bit where I am now, where you are now, where this picture was taken. But it is in the middle of the Baltic Sea. Nothing around, just horizontal. So it's extremely wave exposed. And you see that it is a structure from the glaciation. It's moraine that has been put there, and then the waves have washed out all the fine substrates, and only stones and boulders are left. But they are, as it is so wave exposed, they constantly move. So you find these rounded boulders here everywhere. And the interesting thing, there is of course smaller grains too, because they are crushed all the time. So you have this phenomenon of erosion on the lower parts of the stones where the sand goes by. And better sandblasting, I don't know the name in English, sorry for that. Sandblasting. So you see this, it's quite interesting. You see it on all the stones here. It's like this punk. Again, showing how unstable substrate in this case, due to high wave exposure, doesn't contain so much or any growth. Whereas the larger boulders, more constant, at least for 1 year or half a year or 1.5 year, they have a luxuriant growth of this hippie Corda phylum. Also a picture taken on the highly exposed Gotland coast. So the coasts are along this Baltic Sea, they are extremely different. This is typical. When I talk to people from eastern Baltic Sea and southern Baltic Sea, they don't understand what I'm talking about, but because they don't have any rocks. They have this kind of system. Hell is it's a peninsula in Poland, and it looks like this during summer. I can imagine how that influences the biomass. Although I don't know if it's eutrophication or whatever, it has the most impact on the system in this case, but it's quite depleted. The typical thing for the Baltic coast is like this. This is a picture from the high coast. This is Bill and Bull sitting here waiting for diving, or just between diving. So this is the idyll we have on the Swedish side of the Baltic Sea. I wanted to show this picture. This is the typical, also again, same depth about here on boulders and rocks. We have fucus communities, we have the Pilaella communities, we have green algae, no, not so many green algae. We have a lot of red algae in this, here is some red algae growing, although the picture indicates brown. But this is on hard substrates. If the substrate is moving or too small, we have the entire different communities. In this case, we have these Zostera communities, Zostera marina, one of the few marine phanerogams that occur in the world. And also there are some, here is some fucus, but they probably are just loose plants laying there. And on occasional boulders we have this luxuriant growth of plants. In this case it's fucus communities with its epiphytes and all the animals sitting in that one. The sand is almost depleted from animals and plants. Again, just showing how this transition is so steep when the substrate changes. It is like a razor knife. If we go to more soft substrates again, then we come into these, as I said, the freshwater species. And in this case, it's Potamogeton perfoliatus. It's a freshwater species. They are called seaweeds, I think, in English, all of them. You only find them in freshwater or in the Baltic Sea. And in the Baltic Sea, there can really be quite a lot of them. Another thing that illustrates how important wave exposure is, but on a totally different point of view, is, for instance, which is very say up to date in the discussion here in the Stockholm archipelago, is how ships or some mechanisms influence the wave exposure. This is then typical for a coastline that is flushed every day by ships. In Stockholm there are about 7 or 8 passengers of big ships going through to Finland. So this is like tides. They always get water, and I haven't that picture with me now, unfortunately. But I actually seen Fucus vesiculosus growing 0.5 meter up on the shoreline, because it knows that it gets flushed every 3rd or 4th hour where a big boat comes by. So this is a typical example of how wave exposure can do it. And you also see these erosion lines, what wave exposure does. It takes away all the fine sediments. And this is of course a problem when it takes away the woods too. So this is why we have these, the type of substrate we find in an area is totally, it's say, the ground is of course, or the baseline is of course the geology. Therefore we only have these sandy flats or sandy shores along the southern and eastern coast of the Baltic proper. But then it is the wave motion that actually take away the substrates that makes whether we have soft or mixed or hard substrates. Another phenomenon that is quite interesting if you want to look to the diversity of species is, this is a fucus plant which has epiphytes here, which is in this case Pilaella, not so extremely uprising. But anyhow, the interesting thing is about this plant. This plant is moving like this. It's swept around. It's called a whiplash effect on the substrate. So if you look at the substrate, how it looks here and how it looks here, they are quite different. So this is the undisturbed patch where fucus, the radius of fucus doesn't whip the substrate. And here there's a totally different type of community that is fully set by and can cope with this, be whipped away or whipped around every time a wave goes around this area. So you actually have on the micro scale, you have a very nice dependency on wave exposure, both primary as I showed with these cracks, but also secondary because other species behave in a different way. So it's quite interesting. You can find some really rare species sitting here under these fucus plants moving around. I will now show you some zonation patterns. I will show you some results from the monitoring, from the long-time ecological research, and something more that I have forgotten, but I will eventually see it when I see the pictures. But just to sum up, the interesting thing about all oceans is actually that you actually have, when you look, you actually see a distinct zonation pattern. You can see this in the upper part, which is in the Baltic Sea, dependent on the irregular water level fluctuations, or it is the tidal zone. Then you have the more stable zone, and then within decrease of light, you have a shift in species. Usually in the textbooks it says, or in the low degree textbooks it says, first green algae, then brown algae, and then red algae, forget it. Green algae, of course, they stay at the surface, but the rest, they occur anywhere. Usually, there's not unusual in the Baltic Sea that you find the brown algae deepest down. And this is a special species, Fossolaria arctica. I don't know if we will find it tomorrow for you, or Monday for you. But in general it is like that, because the different species have different pigmentation and can cope with the different light regimes. But also, as important as I said before, it's also the substrate. So when substrate changes, also the species composition changes. This is a typical picture of how it can look in the Baltic Sea in a more or less sheltered area where we have fucus from 0.5 meter down to perhaps 4, 5, 6 meters. I say it's sheltered because I see on the fucus plants it's growing quite upward because it has these bladders, which gives it has its name, bladderwrack, from that, which makes the species going closer to the light. But also you see it on the older parts of the on the thallus of the plants. You find quite a lot of species sitting there. And those are, in this case, what you see is this crustose electra. It's a bryozoan, Electra crustulenta, one of the few you find in the Baltic Sea. And then we have a quite late introduced species. It's these blobs of Balanus improvisus, a species that occurred for the first time around the century shift of 1900. But now has established itself all over the Baltic Sea and is to the nuisance of most boat owners. But also indicating a quite sheltered area is this luxuriant growth of filamentous or of epiphytes on the fucus plants, which have a very long thallus here growing. It's typical for dictyociform funiculaceus growing here. And also we have this abundance of Pilaiella perhaps, which has not yet been torn away by wave motions. Yeah, it's just showing different examples how it can look like around these. So this is then when you go to a little bit more exposed site, we have the upper 0.5 meter again with filamentous algae. In this case it's Cladophora glomerata, which is a freshwater species. You have the typical occurrence here. You can see it. Note how clean the fucus plants are, because they usually are covered by epiphytes during spring or early summer, but then the waves take these epiphytes away. There are some epiphytes on them, but those are the typical, very hardly attached to the plants. In this case, it's Ceramium tinicorne. Epiphytes on plants is not a bad sign, it's a good sign. Too many epiphytes, what is too many epiphytes? It's a bad sign. I'll show you some examples later. This is a typical scene you can see this time of the year, where this green algae community is replaced by the red algae community. Cladophora glomerata is replaced by Ceramium tinicorne, which is forming this upper first 0.5 meter belt during late autumn and winter. It's beautiful. For all of those who are colorblind, I'm sorry, it's a nice picture. I find it's a nice picture. But also during this kind of time of the year, we find another green algae. It's Enteromorpha. Enteromorpha, they occur about 5 different species in the Baltic Sea. Usually people say, it has been said that as soon as you see Enteromorpha, it's a sign of eutrophication, because the species Enteromorpha intestinalis, it's Greek and Latin saying both looking like intestine. It's quite interesting. That one is actually favored by high nutrient load. So you will find abundance of this species where you have quite a lot of nutrients in the water. But if you're out in this time of the year looking at the shorelines, you will find abundance of these enteromorpha because it's this time of the year. It should be there. It has always been here. Also, you can see some of the small species. Those who are sitting close, they see Ceratoderma. It's a cardium species. We have some Theodoxus growing here. The typical for enteromorpha is that they are, like the name tells us, they are hollow. So you can distinguish them from Cladophora, which are not hollow. And they usually have these gas in their bodies. And then this comes to this Nobel Prize question. What kind of gas is it? It's physiology. You must know. What is it? The gas. If you say wrong, I will hit you. You see, it's already broken. I've done it before. What can it be? Can be oxygen, yes. It's a photosynthetic byproduct. Oxygen. Pure oxygen. I like it. We also have these crustaceous algae here. They are red and brown. Usually this is, I think, Lithoderma, a brown one. And this is another species. And also, again, you see these bops here. Those are snails, but also balanus creeping around. We have this very typical is for this, in this case, actually there is a crack here where we have Mytilus and enteromorpha, and this on these bare sides it's mostly is Pilaella littoralis, and then we have small specimen of Fucus. I would guess that this is just taken the upper half meter because those specimens are very small, and probably they will be gone during the next low tide. You see, there are still some small species quite high up, but the bulk of Fucus is coming deeper down. Yeah, same story, but again here you would. Species unknown. Again, you see this example of this the Fucus can, as it grows almost without any competition, it can actually extend its and be quite luxuriant. The upper half, from a half meter down to 3-4 meters, it can cover about 100% of the substrate. Here again, you see this the effect of this whiplash, having different species growing just below. When you come deeper down to 3-4 meters, it's not Cladophora glomerata, which is the freshwater species. It's Cladophora rupestris. It's a marine species. It's nice. Just to show that it is nice in the Baltic Sea. It's not a dead ocean. It's a living ocean. You must say, wow. We talk quite a lot of Fucus, and this is perhaps because it's the most conspicuous species. You actually, it's easy to recognize, it's easy to determine it, and you see it, everyone sees it. But it also is, as it is one of the few perennial species in the Baltic Sea, plant species, and also one of the few that actually grows high and therefore creates a three-dimensional space. It also creates quite a lot of biotope and habitat for other species, which grow then as epiphytes. In this case, there's a hydrozoan sitting here. We have these epiphytic algae, but also then these grazers going around different freshwater snails mostly. We have the mussels sitting here. This is a typical Ceratoderma sitting there. And also Mytilus sitting some here and there. This is a Lumnea creeping around. Hopefully you will see all these species on Tuesday. We will collect, you will collect, and we will collect. So the focus is not, it's not wrong to be interested in focus. So when something happens with focus, everyone is alarmed. And one of the things that was very popular to look at a few years ago is the grazers, how they influence focus. And this is actually a focus plant that has been grazed upon by Idotea. And the focus has actually disappears from areas. And it has been said that it is grazers that do it. But to my knowledge and to my investigations, grazers, they are not so abundant. They are so few, so they can never graze down the focus community. It's impossible. But they can, of course, finish when the focus plants of one or another reason has been, say, in less good conditions, for instance, age. A focus plant only gets 5 to 10 years old, then it's over. It has been reproducing for 2, 3, 4 times, and then it's gone. Then it's usually torn away, or its thallus, the lower thallus, is so weak that it's easy for a Idotea to just give it the last cut, and then it's flushed away by the waves. The interesting thing is, if this seems to be a catastrophic event where focus looks like this, perhaps it was ice that took the plants. But you actually see how focus is regrowing on the holdfasts. It comes back again. So usually focus is adapted to some kind of certain amount of disturbance. It will come back. If the disturbance is too harsh, it will disappear, or if conditions are too bad, then afterwards it will also disappear. Then again we have these focus. You have already seen this picture. Also, another red algae that is common. This picture is a little bit tricky because it's taken quite high up in the water, close to the surface. So the pigmentation of this species is very little. It almost looks like a brown algae, but it is a red algae. It's a Phylophora or Cocotyllus. It's also, there are 2 species in the Baltic Sea. You will see them on Tuesday. They are dark reddish. Usually you have these Fuchsilaria, the typical how they have these forked branches. You have this fluff of Ceramium tenuicorne. You have these corda, these long strings sitting here. Corda filum is the typical one in summer and autumn. In spring there is another species. It was called corda before, now it's, I think, Haplosiphon. And also you have this nuisance for many, Balanus improvisus. It was actually described by Darwin. I don't know why I say that, but Darwin should always be mentioned if you're an evolutionary biologist. Also, what is typical for the Baltic Sea is, this is a typical picture how you can see it when you dive. You have, this is probably Polysiphonia, different species. You have Rhodomela is also a red algae you will probably see. This is the abundance of Mytilus, the blue mussel. If you take samples in the Baltic Sea, the blue mussels, if you put the total biomass, the blue mussels will make about 80–90% of the total biomass of animals. So blue mussels are really important for the system. I don't know how much Nisse talked about it this morning. Hopefully He said everything, so I will not repeat myself. But it looks like this. The interesting thing here is that Electra and Balance seems to compete with Mytilus for space because there is no Mytilus here. Mytilus, they can actually move around with their byssus. This is an interesting picture compared to the next picture I will show. You see that here Fucus is, the Mytilus is growing on all types of substrates, on all horizons of the rock. This indicates for me that it is a fairly exposed area I'm looking at. This picture shows how it can look like. This is on a vertical wall in a really shallow area. On the vertical wall, sedimentation is no-no because it will just drop by. And on these vertical faces, there Mytilus can sit, and it's really in abundance, a really lot of Mytilus. But on all more or less horizontal areas, the sedimentation is so high that they can't sit. So that you will find no Mytilus due to the too high sedimentation, and then again you find them just 1 centimeter where there is no sediments on the substrate. Again, shows how important the type of substrate is. The conditions, how substrate really rules the occurrence of the species and also rules the patchiness of the occurrence of species, as we see. Mytilus is, as I said, the dominating one, and why is that? On the Swedish west coast, a Mytilus community would most probably look like this, where all the sea stars are all over it and eats everything away. So you never find, or extremely seldom find, large Mytilus communities below the intertidal in marine areas. Mytilus is sitting just in the intertidal or on poles where extremely high wave exposure, because they have a very thick shell there and very good byssus that keeps them. But this is not the case in the Baltic, so they don't have this space. But on the other hand, they don't have the predators. Yeah, this is again a picture showing how important the substrate is for the communities. This is how Zostera communities can look like in the Baltic Sea. It's like anywhere. You have the most rich, luxuriant Zostera communities, I think, in the world are in the Baltic Sea. It's along the south coast of the Baltic Sea, in the Skåne area, in the Öresund area, in the belt areas, and then in the Kalmarsund area and around the island of Gotland. Where they actually, this is a picture from the island, around the island of Gotland, where they actually form vast areas with grass, meadows. In the Stockholm area, this is a picture taking, an old picture taking just at the limit of Zostera communities in the Baltic Sea. It's like in the Norrtälje area. Those who know Stockholm know what I'm talking about. It's about 150, 60 kilometers north of Stockholm, where the northern limit is. And there you see these occasional Zostera plants, and they grow together with a different Potamogeton species. We have this Myriophyllum species. They are all covered by Mytilus. They have these freshwater snails on them. And always on sandy substrate. This is a quite interesting thing. If you look at Zostera communities on the Swedish west coast, they almost exclusively occur in shallow bays where it's soft substrate. In the Baltic Sea and from the Öresund, it's always on sandy mixed substrates. Extremely seldom you find them on soft substrate. So there is a change. I don't know why. Again, this shows how important substrate is. This fucus grows on a boulder, and you have a lot of Ruppia marina and Potamogeton pectinatus here. Everything covered with Pilaella, and this abundance of these small creatures here are these mysids, small crustaceans swimming in swarms. not fish. This is a typical picture from a sheltered bay in the Bothnian Sea, where the dominant species is Potamogeton perfoliatus, which is the freshwater species. But on this quite soft substrate, we actually have a living Fucus community. Fucus vesiculosus is living here in patches loose. And as it is a sheltered area, this Fucus will not move so much, so it can actually stay there for 5 or 10 years. So it's actually a functional community. It's not anything that is showing decaying community. So this is quite interesting. So you have these kind of nice communities in the Baltic Sea. The most exploited one are the Fuscularia communities along the coast of Estonia and Latvia, where they have since the 30s, 40s, they have harvested those communities for alginats, and still are. And it's a million industry. Again, showing how this interesting thing in the Baltic Sea, which you don't find anywhere else, this mixture of algae communities, luxuriant algae communities, together with the luxuriant growth of phanerogams. It's quite interesting. It really you can think of what's going on. This picture I have seen. This is a very nice creature. It's you like it because you find it. As this is the what do you call it, the housekeeper on the seafloor. As soon as something dead comes down, they are there. The easiest way to catch them is to throw in a dead fish, and they will. We have 20 of them. This picture is quite interesting. It's a large one. It is like this, So you be careful. When I looked at the picture, there's another species here. It's actually also a mucid swimming over it. Those who sit close, they see the eyes, and this is the back of it. You have to look for the species of the animal species. Here is the abundance of these Cerastoderma all over, covered by these flushy filamentous green algae. But also, of course, we have this flatfish, which quickly changes its color after the background. And also this one is, pigvar. I don't know the name in English. They are so nice, these large fish. This one is about, actually, I don't know. Ljuger inte. This was like this size here, over here. It's also on the Salvoreve area, and then it actually has this pigmentation like the boulders around. I like that. Quite interesting species. A very interesting future aspect of the Baltic Sea is the occurrence of gobies. This is the black goby, which is a native species. We have it here, I don't know since how long. But this is a male. You find it as long as you have boulders and some gravels and holes, you will find them in high abundance. But in recent years, they have introduced a new goby that is called the black-mouthed goby. I don't know exactly its name. And this is a voracious feeder on anything. They occur down in Poland in this outside hell, for instance, I showed before. Therefore, it's really hell now down there. They get quite big. They are fished and they are tasty. So, as a fisher point of view or a culinary point of view, they are welcome. But on the other hand, they like Mytilus. They eat quite a lot of Mytilus. We have seen them now in the Norrtäljeviken, and we have seen them in Finland, and we have seen them in more south of the coast. So they will occur. And it's very interesting to know now if they actually can force a shift in the function of the ecosystem, as Nisse told about how important Mytilus is for the whole community, the recirculation of nutrients, etc. It should be very interesting to know whether that new species will have a major impact on the system. It's something for you to take up. This is just a nice picture from touristic point of view. It's the high coast in Baltic Sea. Go there, it's beautiful. The interesting with the northern part of the Baltic Sea is that the sea level or the land rise is quite impressive. It's 1 meter, about 1 meter per 100 meters. So this is the mark of where the water was in 1749. And that guy is now at the present level of the water. So it's about, was it 2.5, 3.5 meters? And that's just in a few hundred years. So what you see in, if you want to study succession, natural succession along the seashores, you go up to the north and look at the coast, how they change with time. It's quite interesting. This is a guy standing, again, typical for the Baltic Sea is that you have these filamentous algae, but we really have to look for fucus because they usually start first at 2 meters depth. And this is because of ice. There we have a lot of ice. But when we have fucus, it's quite abundant. It looks the same as in the Baltic Sea proper. And it also is, from the species composition and so on, it's quite similar. This is just a curious fish, stickleback, typical freshwater species occurring in high abundance Baltic Sea. Lena will talk about this. When we come up into the Botnian Sea, nothing much is happening, but we actually find 2 different morphs of Fucus vesiculosus. One is the more broad talus, and then one is the more narrow talus. This one, if they grow together, I can distinguish them. If they grow separately, I can't distinguish them because I have no other things to go. Just looking at how narrow they are. And you actually, there is a gradient going from broad to narrow. This one is half the width of the ones you find in the Baltic proper. So, but this species has been, and Lena will talk about, this is a new species, they say. I don't say so, because I'm a stubborn old man. Other things that occur in the Botnian Sea is the occurrence of freshwater species and mosses. This is a moss, Fontinolis dolicholica, growing. So this is one of the early phycologists in Sweden, Mats Wern. He said this is the good sign of being in the Botnian Sea. But also typical for the Botnian Sea is in shallow areas is abundance of carassians. We again see the number of phanerogams. This is a typical picture taken in extremely shallow and sheltered bay where this species occurs. I know that I had never, Lena, who is talking tomorrow, she was always taking this species as a typical for the Baltic Sea. I never seen it until a few years ago when I went into these really shallow bays. It's Nias. So this is typical for that area. And this green thing, that is not a plant. It's an animal. It's a small one-celled ciliate species growing in these spherical colonies, but they grow in symbiosis with small one-celled algae, therefore they're green. Also quite interesting feature. No one has looked at it. Just see what happens. Yeah, this is just... Speaking about Mats Wern, he made now come to some results. Just tell me when I should stop, so I do that. Mats Wern, he made quite a nice, interesting investigation in the Gräsö area that is here in the southern part of the Baltic Sea in the 40s, and we had the opportunity to revisit his place in the mid-80s, 40 years after he was there. And what we saw that Fucus had decreased dramatically in its depth distribution, and also the bulk of Fucus had been shifted upwards towards the surface. And this was taken as an sign for eutrophication. Eutrophication is actually increasing primary production, decreasing the light that comes down to the substrate. And this was a hard proof as we thought of it. And this is the same results. It's also from Mats Wern's stations. This was how deep he found Fucus at the different stations we revisited in 1984. And we saw on almost all stations, Fucus had decreased its depth distribution. But then we were there again in the beginning of the 90s, and we saw at several of the stations, Fucus had again increased its depth distribution. And this continued further in the 96, and as we were down there in 2006, we actually saw that Fucus went as deep down as in the 40s, in the mid-2000s, and at all stations that we looked at. Quite interesting, indicating that we have nowadays again pristine conditions in the Baltic Sea, at least in the Gräsö area. This is the Aska area. You will be there next week. These are all the stations I revisit every year since the beginning of the 90s. So you can subdivide them in inner, middle and outer area. And if you look at the distribution of Fucus in this area, if you have the mean depth, it's based on several stations. It's a mean. It's not the maximum depth. It's a mean depth. And the different years, we actually see that in the middle part of the archipelago, the mean depth of Fucus has increased by 2 meters from the 90s to 2010. I think this graph stops. Quite impressive. The change has not been as big, as large in the outer archipelago. Almost very little has happened. And also then in the intermediate area, it is again this is the area that is also has changed quite a lot. And totally then, if you took it, it's over 1 meter. Fucus grows deeper now than the 90s. So it's also in accordance with what we saw in the Gräsö area. And I also seen same trend in the Stockholm archipelago, but then I only have about 4 or 5 observations. So it is we see an increase in the depth distribution of Fucus, which can be then interpreted as the Baltic getting cleaner and better, and we had some discussions about that. This is just showing the queue. I will drop that one. Yeah, we also at 6 of these stations I showed before, we take quantitative samples, and the interesting thing, if you look at Mytilus, which is one of the most important species, we actually see that in the inner parts of the archipelago, Fucus biomass has decreased quite a lot since the beginning of the 90s. And this can then be interpreted, if it's me, I will interpret it as less food for Mytilus, Why less food? Yes, less primary production. Why less primary production? Less eutrophication, better conditions, at least in the inner parts. In the middle parts of the archipelago, I see no trend. But in the outer parts of the archipelago, one of the stations shows a clear trend, and the other ones shows a clear trend since the beginning of the 2000s. So there are factors, even this animal species, give an indication of better conditions. There is less production to eat. And other species that are dependent on what's coming from the pelagic system are the detritivores, and they also show since the beginning of the 20s on both stations there is a decreasing trend. So this is quite interesting. So we actually seems to see a improvement of the Baltic Sea conditions in the phytobenthic communities. We had a discussion today. Also, the bentho sees it, but the pelagic doesn't want to see it. Although I interpret their data very positively, I also see it. Then back to filamentous algae. There have been some nice theories recent years that shows that there's a coupling between filamentous algae and herbivores. Filamentous algae, they should increase when eutrophication increases. Oh, they all increase. Okay, the trend was not so obvious, but when adding late years, it has been significant for many stations, several stations. Although the last 2 years here, I have never seen so few filamentous algae, so I think this trend line is a little bit off now. So, filamentous algae increases, that should mean that the herbivores increase, because they are the ones that graze down the filamentous algae. Oh shit, they also increase. This popular theory is actually, my data doesn't support this popular theory that the grazers actually can control the filamentous algae. There's something else going on. Or you can say that you have to see what kind of grazers there are. Are there those kind of grazers, or are there other kind of grazers which then co-variate with the filamentous algae, and which filamentous algae are the ones that increase and which are decreasing. So it's not so easy to do this bulk comparison. So you have to look to more detail. So my message is, do your experiments, but look then into nature and see if it's actually true what you see in your experiments. This is one of the eating. There is an actually area where I've seen that competition actually, I think, as a top-down mechanism actually occurs, I think. It's when you go to these in the middle of the Baltic Sea, there are two these offshore areas. It's Hoburgsbankar and Mytsjöbankar. Mytsjöbankar has, this picture is taken about 20 meters depth. All the boulders there, they're almost covered with Mytilus. And if you go to the same depth at Hoburgsbankar, it's very little Mytilus you find. And they have exactly the same physical conditions, the same composition, boulders, and then surrounded by sand, deep, extremely wave exposed, horizon all over. There's nothing coming up from the surface, to the surface. The only thing that differs is that at Hoburgsbankar, at that time I made this investigation, about 1 million of these diving ducks overwinter. It's 1/2, I think it's 1/4 of the total global population is sitting over Hoburgsbankar, but they're not, very few are on the middle bank, which is about 100 kilometers south of or 50 kilometers south of Hoburgsbankar. So traditionally, they sit on Huberspeicher, eat every Mytilus, which then they eat about 40%, I think, of the total production of Mytilus per year. So this actually then has an impact on the system. They haven't learned to move a bit further south, more in the more open area. Quite interesting. Another quite interesting phenomenon is this Cerastoderma, which actually had an enormous increase in the start of the 20th century in all stations. And this was due to extremely hot summers, I think the year before, or 2 years before. So they had a really successful reproduction. So several of my stations, they have this cover of millions of Cerastoderma. So this is perhaps a species that will come when we have global change. Everything will be Cerastoderma instead of Mytilus. This is just showing this is now ice. Ice is occurring everywhere, but not so often. It's very seldom on the Swedish west coast. It's more often in the Aska area. Of course, in shallow bays, it's still there. But a few years ago, there was extremely a lot of ice, and we actually saw it. This is the upper half meter, and then it's just perhaps 1 meter down here. We actually saw that the upper part of the Fucus community was torn away by ice. So there are occasions where Fucus actually can be influenced by ice, but usually, as I said before, it's the water level fluctuations. And here again you see how new plants are pushing up from the old forest. Same. This is just the extreme of ice coring. It's in the northern Quark, where the rock is bad of all the lichens up to about 10 meters from the shoreline here. Here every year ice cover goes over this rock, and people have been observing about 17-meter high icebergs. Ice goes together outside here, so you can 1/10, 170 meters. Who knows? But actually, I've seen boulders this size which have been torn around. They show the bottom up. You see it on the cover of the species in this area. It's quite interesting. If you have these kind of communities so unstable, you will only find annual species growing here. In this case, it's a very nice green algae belt, but it's totally covered by diatoms, and therefore it occurs yellow on the picture. Yeah. Shall I stop here? I don't know if you want to hear more. If you see algae on the shore, it's a good sign if it's Fucus or something else. It's even a good sign if it's ceramium and it stinks like hell. It's really ugly, this smell. It's pictures taken outside Gotland. Here, different filamentous algae shown. This is a blue-green cyanobacteria nowadays called, it's Rivularia growing here. You have ceramium in this case, and you have Cladophia in that case. Again, this is a typical, as I showed before. When it looks like this, people get annoyed because the Pilaella here sits on their gear and hinders them to catch fish. But it looks like this. This is, for me, it's typical. If I see this, if I see a picture like this, I would guess, oh, it's a quite sheltered area. Nothing more. Quite sheltered areas usually have this kind of appearance. It's normal. Oh, this is a Fucus plant, totally covered by epiphytes. I say, yeah, so what? Fucus is actually growing here. It has its it's replicating. This is a typical picture taking just in the wrong time of the year, when it is covered by filamentous algae. Most probably, it's not covered by filamentous algae during the time of the year when it is important for fucus to grow and reproduce. This again is a picture of Asker. You will see it next week when you go from the ship and you have passed the boathouse on the right side. You see this fucus community. Compare how many epiphytes there are now on the fucus. There's still some I saw, but it's not so many. But if you see a fucus like this, totally covered by these bryozoans, and also there is abundance of Balanus. This is a good sign of here something is fishy. Something is, it's beautiful. These two species are filter feeders. They like organic material in the water, and the fucus also looks dark and also usually twisted. This is a picture taking about outside Lutviken, or Utviken as it actually is called. It's a pulp mill in the Bay of Sundsvall. If it looks like this, it is eutrophicated. And this is horrible. This is actually horrible. The cladophora here is about 1/2 meter long. You find the same kind of cladophora in the inner parts of the Stockholm archipelago, inside Oxdjupet. This is a real sign of eutrophication. All the nutrients that come from the lake Mälaren. This is so it should look like when it's eutrophicated, and so it should look like when it's eutrophicated. Totally covered, 1 meter long. And if you find old latrine tons and Baden-Baden shares, then it's polluted. But those are pictures taken inside the. Yeah, this is also. Balanus is usually a sign of high nutrients. If it looks like this, a lot of dead organic material decaying with this film of spirulina, I think it was. This is totally natural. This is the way of nature to take care of the dead organic matter that has fallen down from the cliff down to the soft substrate. So this is also when you see these Begatoa fields with this bacteria, it's quite natural. It is the way of nature to recycle. Actually, those who sit close to me, you see that the reduction is just stops at the surface where the Begatoa grows, and then fish swim along here. I think it's one of the gobies, the most common fish in the Baltic Sea, Lerstubbe. Yeah, I think we stop now. Do you have any questions to this picture? I think I will finish now.